Marcus Halloway paused mid-sip, the steaming mug of herbal tea trembling in his hand as he stared at the glow of his phone screen. The house around him was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the HVAC system and the distant ticking of a wall clock. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Maplewood, Colorado, had long since surrendered to the stillness of night. Outside the window, the tops of the evergreen trees swayed gently in a breeze that carried the crisp scent of alpine pines. Indoors, though, his world had just been shattered. He'd never been one for late-night messages, preferring to tuck himself into bed with a book and let exhaustion pull him under. But habit, or perhaps curiosity, had driven him to check his phone one more time before surrendering to sleep. The notification banner blinked insistently. A new text message from a contact named Clarissa Halloway. Yet as he opened it, his heart lurched. The words burned into his consciousness like acid. That contemptible fraud deserves to lose everything. The phrase didn't make sense, at least not in its intended context. His mind raced. Who was Clarissa calling a fraud? Why would she wish such ruin on anyone? He tapped the message thread, scrolling up, but it seemed to start in medias res, as if he'd intercepted a private conversation not meant for his eyes. His pulse pounded. He glanced toward the staircase, where the lights in the upstairs bedroom were off. His wife, Clara, should have been asleep for at least an hour. Marcus was 38 years old and had spent the past 12 years as the lead school counselor at Redwood Middle Academy. He had arrived in Maplewood straight out of graduate school, eager to apply his training in child psychology and conflict resolution. Over the years, he had guided countless adolescents through their darkest hours: bullying, self-doubt, family strife. He'd seen tears of relief, witnessed breakthroughs that transformed lives. Helping students find their footing had always felt like his calling. At home, he and Clara had built a quiet sanctuary together. They'd celebrated 9 years of marriage the previous spring, marking each anniversary with a modest gift or a handwritten note. Marcus remembered the night they wed beneath a canopy of twinkling fairy lights at Pinecrest Gardens, just outside town. Surrounded by their closest friends and family, they'd promised each other unwavering support, companionship through life's victories and defeats. He'd believed, truly believed, that nothing could shake the foundation they'd built. Up until tonight, that belief had held. They shared everything, or so he thought. Hopes, fears, grocery lists, even a joint cloud storage account for family photos and shared calendars. Years ago, Marcus had set up the cloud drive as a convenience. Clara had moved between homes and offices so often during her tenure at Meridian Marketing Group that it seemed practical for both of them to access the same files: recipes, tax documents, travel itineraries. It was a small gesture of intimacy, one that spoke to their trust. Now, at 11:48 p.m., trust felt like a cruel joke. He realized, with a cold twist of dread, that this message had not been meant for him at all, but had arrived because of that very shared cloud profile. That tiny technical convenience, a password he'd programmed and shared without a second thought, had opened a window into Clara's private life, a life he had assumed was shared fully with him. Instead, it was a labyrinth of secrets. He took a shallow breath, trying to steady himself. The lamp on his desk cast soft light over the scattered paperwork: counseling notes, tomorrow's lesson plans, a half-finished letter to a grateful parent. Everything he had touched tonight now seemed tainted by suspicion. Marcus set the mug down so forcefully that it rattled the coaster. He stared at the dark liquid sloshing gently inside the cup, thinking how something so ordinary could feel suddenly alien. The words, contemptible fraud, felt too clinical for what he suspected was happening. Whom was Clara calling a fraud? Had she been speaking ill of him? He scrolled once more, fingers trembling now, and read the next line. anyone would believe my lies. Lies. His wife was plotting falsehoods against someone. His breath caught. The concept was inconceivable. Backlit by the cold glow of the screen, Marcus's reflection stared back at him, pale, wide-eyed, hollowed by shock. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, as if the walls themselves were recoiling from what he'd discovered. He rose from his leather office chair without conscious thought, pacing to the window. Below, the porch light cast a narrow beam across the front walkway. Beyond, the street lamps dotted the neighborhood like distant constellations. In the distance, a lone car cruised by, unaware of the turmoil unfolding behind lit windows at 321 Evergreen Lane. He pressed his palm against the glass, feeling the cool surface through his shirt. Memories of his early days in Maplewood flickered through his mind. The first time he drove down Main Street and saw the charming brick facades. The crisp autumn morning when Clara and he bought their home. The countless evenings spent curled up on the sofa, planning vacations or laughing over takeout. Every moment suggested a partnership built on mutual respect and love. And now, he wasn't sure what to believe. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the clarity that served him so well in counseling sessions. Marcus had always prided himself on empathy, on listening deeply to others' perspectives. He could help teenagers untangle their emotions because he approached their pain without judgment. Yet this was different. This was his life unraveling. He had no external guide, no third party to mediate. The discovery was raw, personal, and devastating. Slowly, reluctantly, he reopened his eyes and stared at the phone screen again. Below the first two lines were timestamps and a name: Clara. Tessa. His wife was texting her sister, Tessa Monroe, conspiring in private about him, about their marriage, about what she planned to do to him. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He felt the air rush out of his lungs, stomach dropping to his feet. Marcus sank back into the chair, letting his head fall against the backrest. The leather bore the imprint of his shoulders, a familiar comfort now tinged with irony. That very chair, where he had spent so many nights preparing counseling programs or drafting heartfelt emails to former students, was now witness to his greatest betrayal. He closed his eyes, trying to still the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He thought of Clara's gentle smile, the way she used to cradle his hand during long drives across the Rockies. He thought of the encouraging notes she'd left on his bathroom mirror the morning of his first day at Redwood, reminding him to trust his instincts. He thought of the laughter they'd shared in cafes and bookstores, planning a shared future that seemed so bright. All of it now felt like a facade, her true feelings hidden behind coded messages and strategic silences. Some deep part of him resisted the impulse to confront her immediately. The counselor in him knew that raw accusations could shatter truth as easily as lies. He needed evidence, perspective, a plan. And yet another part of him ached with the urge to wake her, demand explanations, watch her stammer and apologize. But the house was still, the clocks ticking, and outside, the world carried on unknowing. Finally, he placed the phone face down on the desk, silencing the screen's glow. He rose again, crossing to the built-in bookcase, where titles on human behavior and conflict resolution stood like silent sentinels. He reached for a narrow volume on trust and betrayal and let it fall closed with a soft thud. The irony of seeking answers in theory while living betrayal was not lost on him. Yet as the minutes passed, a determined calm began to settle in his chest. The initial shock gave way to a cold clarity. He would not be the hapless victim of a private war he didn't even know existed. He would gather the truth, understand the scope of her plans, and decide his next steps with the same patience and strategy he encouraged in his students. The safety of his home, the integrity of his marriage, and the stability of his world depended on it. He turned back to the desk, where the heretofore friendly confines of his office seemed charged with new meaning. The past 9 years of his life with Clara, the dozen with Redwood's children, all of it balanced precariously on a single intercepted message. He picked up the phone again, thumb hovering above the thread. With a steadying breath, he prepared to scroll deeper into a private conversation that threatened everything he'd believed in. Marcus Halloway sat motionless at his desk, long after the kitchen monitor had gone dark, the glow of the camera's feed replaced by the low amber light of a single desk lamp. He had watched Clara in that bright, airy kitchen, where he'd lovingly prepared her breakfast each morning of their 9-year marriage, scheming with a voice that was not entirely her own. On that Friday night, she'd been on the phone with a man whose tone was cold and calculating, pacing before the olive green sofa they'd picked out together in the living room. "I swear he doesn't suspect a thing," Clara had said, her voice measured. "He's far too trusting, almost naive. He really believes we can fix this." The shadow of betrayal pressed against Marcus's chest as he replayed her words. She had spoken of starting over after the divorce, picturing new beginnings in a city far from Maplewood, Colorado, while Marcus would be left professionally damaged and struggling to keep his job at Redwood Middle Academy. By the time he turned off the feeds, his hands had curled into fists so tight that his knuckles whitened. The realization crashed over him. Clara wasn't merely planning to leave. She was intent on obliterating everything he had built: his career, his reputation, his very identity. For an hour, Marcus stared blankly at the pale gray wall of his study. He pictured the kitchen's polished marble countertop, the vintage Pendleton rug beneath it, the gleaming chrome faucets he'd installed last summer, symbols of the home they had painstakingly crafted together. Now those markers of shared joy seemed grotesquely ironic, as if the house itself conspired in Clara's ruse. By Monday morning, he had settled on a course. Under the pretense of retrieving forgotten lesson plans, he doubled back from the drive to Redwood, slipping unseen into the house to capture new footage. The cameras recorded Clara in quiet conference with a woman, an attorney from Atwater and Hale, whose voice droned through the speaker in clipped legalese. "I've reviewed your initial consultation," the lawyer was saying. "We have a strong case for spousal support and division of assets. Document every incident, dates, times, behaviors. Even normal disagreements can be reframed to suggest intimidation." Clara had nodded eagerly, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. The sight of her meticulous pen strokes, the gleam in her eye as she wrote phrases like "felt threatened and controlled," churned Marcus's stomach. He watched her rehearse lines about emotional distress, practice the moment she'd feign tears. She even tested her performance in front of their living room mirror, adjusting the angle of her head, dialing the quiver in her voice until it sounded convincingly traumatic. That afternoon, Clara called Tessa, her sister, whose laughter rang like ice over the speaker. "It's happening," Clara had gushed. "Permanent alimony? Possibly the house. He'll never see it coming." Each word punctuated Marcus's sense that he was living alongside a stranger who had weaponized the intimacy of their marriage. On Wednesday morning, Marcus feigned illness and drove south to Jefferson City. He found sanctuary in the modest office of Elliot Morgan, a divorce attorney whose reputation for defending against false allegations was as solid as the oak paneling on his walls. Morgan greeted him with a firm handshake, his gray-streaked hair and weary eyes conveying decades of witness to human deceit. "Mr. Halloway," Morgan said after listening to the evidence, 3 weeks of recordings, messages, clandestine strategy sessions. "I've never seen documentation this comprehensive." He paused, then leaned forward. "But we must be strategic. If we unleash everything at once, they'll cry foul, claim tampering or context-taking, Instead, we'll let her present her narrative under oath, then introduce the recordings to dismantle her credibility. Think of it as a psychological pivot. Once the judge sees she planned each detail, her entire case unravels. Marcus walked out into the crisp April air with a plan to maintain normalcy at home. Morgan's parting counsel echoed in his mind. Don't change your behavior. Don't give her any sign you know what's coming. Act exactly as you always have. So Marcus returned to Maplewood, pouring himself into his morning routine, brewing dark roast coffee, straightening his tie before the mirror, kissing Clara's cheek with practiced warmth. She asked about his day in that familiar, syrupy tone he once found comforting. "Fine," he replied, voice steady. "Just fine." The cameras continued to record. Each evening, Marcus watched Clara's steady descent into her own deception. Phone calls with Jennifer Reeves, Clara's trial attorney, fine-tuning the timeline of abuse, scripting witness statements for Tessa, and coordinating interviews with friends who would testify that Marcus's calm demeanor belied a simmering rage. Over cappuccinos at the neighborhood cafe, Clara tested her story on unsuspecting patrons, watching for natural reactions, feeding off the sympathy she would later deploy in court. Then came the hearing. Clara arrived in a tailored navy suit, hair softly curled, presenting as the fragile victim she'd rehearsed to perfection. Reeves stood behind her, weaving a compelling narrative of a controlling husband who had isolated his wife, weaponized silence, and stifled her career ambitions. For 90 minutes, Clara delivered testimony so polished it might have been choreographed. Tessa followed, corroborating every crafted detail. Marcus sat behind Morgan, heart pounding, as the judge, the Honorable Margaret Sinclair, listened with furrowed brow. When the plaintiff's case concluded, Sinclair adjusted her glasses, ready to issue a ruling on temporary support and exclusive house occupancy, until Morgan rose. "Your Honor," Morgan began, voice calm but firm. "The defense respectfully requests permission to present evidence that directly contradicts the testimony we have just heard." He connected his laptop, and the courtroom screen flickered to life with the recording of Clara practicing her tears in front of their fireplace mirror. There was a collective intake of breath as Clara's own words echoed through the hushed chamber. Lines about being too afraid to leave, being controlled, being made to feel trapped. The judge's gaze flicked between the screen and Clara, whose composure cracked for a fleeting second. Behind Marcus, Morgan watched the courtroom's reaction, his expression unreadable. Marcus felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in days, righteous vindication, mingled with pity for the woman who'd cast him as a villain. The air in the courtroom was thick with the weight of exposure, Clara's carefully constructed world of lies collapsing under the glare of unedited footage. As the recording ended, Marcus allowed himself a quiet exhale. The struggle was far from over. Legal maneuvers, motions to suppress evidence, potential appeals. But in that moment, the truth had broken free of its chains. Clara's betrayal, once so intimate and hidden, lay bare for all to see. Marcus found himself trembling, not from fear, but from the release of months of tension. Through the oak-paneled courtroom doors, the solidity of the world he knew seemed to hold steady again. He would rebuild his practice, his reputation, his life, and he would do so with the same calm determination he had always encouraged in his students. Because some battles, he realized, are worth fighting not just to win, but to reclaim the very essence of who you are. And this one was worth every ounce of strategy, every measured step, every silent vigil in the dark. Marcus Holloway leaned back in the witness chair as the last video clip faded from the courtroom monitor, the muted hum of the projector lingering in the heavy hush. He watched, in heart-stopping silence, as his wife, Clara Holloway, rehearse the very words she'd just delivered under oath 30 minutes earlier. Clara stood before their living room mirror in the recording, voice trembling with deliberate, practiced anguish. "He never hit me, but the way he looks when he's angry is terrifying," she'd whispered, eyes welling with manufactured tears. Across the aisle, Clara's counsel, Natalie Price of Hawthorne and Price Law, sprang to her feet. "Objection! Your Honor, these recordings are prejudicial and taken out of context." Price's voice cracked with urgency, but Judge Patricia Knox's gavel came down before the objection could fully register. "Overruled," Knox said, her tone slow, deliberate. "This court finds the evidence directly bears on the credibility of the testimony just given." One clip bled into the next. Clara coaching her sister, Tessa Monroe, on how to swear under oath. Hushed phone conversations with Price's office about fabricating text message threads. Laughter shared with friends over coffee as Clara plotted to destroy his good name. Every frame, every word, laid bare the conspiracy that Marcus had documented in secret. When the final footage concluded, the courtroom remained deathly still, save for the soft whir of the air conditioning vents overhead. Judge Knox pressed her fingertips together and regarded Clara with an expression that combined disbelief and contempt. "Counselor Price," Knox said, nodding toward Clara's table, "has your client reconsidered her testimony in light of this evidence?" Clara sat rigid, her face drained of color. Price murmured urgently in her ear, but the moment had slipped away. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Knox sighed. "Very well. The case is dismissed with prejudice. I further grant Mr. Halloway exclusive use of the marital residence and all accounts pending the final divorce decree. The district attorney is hereby directed to review these tapes for possible perjury or fraud." A stunned hush fell over the gallery. Clara slumped in her seat, shoulders collapsing as if the weight of her own duplicity had become unbearable. Without a backward glance, she rose and stumbled out of the courtroom, Price trailing behind her in frantic whispers. Outside, Marcus felt the air rush back into his lungs in a single ecstatic breath. He remained seated until the room emptied, absorbing the gravity of Judge Knox's ruling. The years of dread and suspicion, the clandestine surveillance, all had culminated here. He let his gaze linger on the empty plaintiff's table, recalling every rehearsal, every lie engineered behind his back. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. Under the terms of the decree, Clara retained only her personal belongings and her car. Her attorney withdrew in disgrace the day after the hearing. Word of the court's unmasking of her perjury spread swiftly through Maplewood's tight-knit marketing community. Former colleagues recoiled at the mere mention of her name. "Impossible to trust," local recruiters whispered. Job offers evaporated. She moved in with Tessa, a diminished figure haunted by the echoes of her own deceit. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in the home at 321 Evergreen Lane, a house he had once thought symbolized his dreams. But the walls bore too many memories of a marriage that had been little more than a carefully crafted illusion. 1 year later, he sold the property and purchased a modest craftsman bungalow near Redwood Middle Academy. The new home featured a small workshop off the backyard, where he could sink into woodworking each evening, carving solace from fallen maple and oak. At school, the students noticed the change. The counselor who once wore a faint tension at the corners of his eyes now greeted each child with a serene presence. In the hushed hallways, he seemed more grounded, more genuinely available. When he held group sessions on trust, he spoke with a newfound authenticity. Trust is like a bridge, strong when built carefully, but easily severed if you take it for granted. Marcus carried that lesson into every aspect of his life. He resolved never to bestow his confidence lightly again, but he also refused to retreat into bitterness. "Guard your trust," he'd tell a student recovering from betrayal, "but don't let betrayal make you a stranger to hope." 2 years later, he ran into Clara at Maplewood Market, where she stood in the produce aisle, her shoulders stooped as she weighed avocados. Their eyes met briefly, hers glassy with regret, his steady with calm equanimity. They exchanged a courteous nod and parted ways. There were no words left to say. Last month, Marcus began seeing someone new. Grace Donovan, an art teacher at Cedarwood Elementary across town. She had a quick laugh, warm brown eyes, and an easy confidence that stood in marked contrast to the performances he'd witnessed. Their first date was a simple walk along the Maple River Trail, where they talked about children's books, favorite sketching materials, and the beauty of sunrise light on dew-sparkled grass. Grace was candid about what she wanted: honesty, clarity, a partnership built on mutual respect. Together, they moved at a gentle pace: coffee between classes, shared lunches in the faculty lounge, evenings spent teaching Clara's old favorite board games, minus any rehearsed cruelty. With Grace, Marcus felt the difference between foundation and facade. Every small gesture, a hand on the small of his back, an unexpected note left on his car, was underscored by genuine affection rather than calculated performance. Some quiet nights, Marcus sits on his front porch under the soft glow of string lights, listening to the summer crickets and the distant hum of car tires on asphalt. He thinks back to those tense 3 weeks when his house was his secret command center, when every camera feed felt like a life-or-death ledger of truth versus falsehood. He remembers the cold urgency that propelled him to install hidden recorders, the surreal relief as each piece of evidence fell into place. He learned that fighting fiction with raw emotion is a losing battle. Instead, he let the unvarnished truth speak in its own steady, unerring way. He discovered that the strongest revenge is not to break someone in return, but to break free. Free from deception, free from fear, free to rebuild a life on his own terms. The final lesson, he reflects, is this: the best revenge isn't about vindication or recompense. It's about reclaiming your integrity, your peace of mind, and the quiet knowledge that you answered lies not with cruelty, but with the unwavering light of truth.